They say you can sense the character of a neighborhood from the moment you cross its threshold. When I first drove under the ornate wrought iron sign proclaiming Brookside Meadows, I felt both awe and a tiny quiver of apprehension. The place looked immaculate. Wide streets flanked by symmetrical lawns, each yard meticulously landscaped with trimmed hedges and color-coordinated flowers. Elegant mailboxes, uniform in style, lined the curb. The real estate agent had described Brookside Meadows as a highly regulated yet serene community. After years in the bustle of a larger city, I was ready for a calmer environment, especially because of my new project, caring for 2 miniature horses named Daisy and Scout. They weren't mere pets. They were therapy animals, part of an equine-assisted therapy program that helped individuals, especially children, cope with anxiety, depression, or developmental challenges. I was a licensed mental health counselor specializing in animal-assisted interventions, and I needed a stable, friendly space to keep these small horses. My new house on Hawthorne Lane offered a large backyard with a small barn enclosure that I'd spent months customizing for Daisy and Scout's comfort. My first day moving in was bright and cloudless. The neighbors seemed polite but distant, casting curious glances at the sight of a custom horse trailer parked on my driveway. I guess it's unusual to see even miniature horses in a suburban setting. But I figured it would be fine. The local zoning codes allowed for small livestock in certain residential tracts if they served a licensed therapeutic or service purpose. My real estate agent had insisted it was permissible, though subject to HOA rules. I'd read those rules carefully. They said farm animals are disallowed unless individually approved for therapy or service uses, which my horses definitely qualified for, as I had official documentation. The single worry in the back of my mind was, what if the HOA president is reluctant to accept them? But my agent assured me no one in an HOA would try to block recognized therapy animals, especially if I kept them contained and followed guidelines. Little did I know how quickly that assumption would be tested by Karen Lancaster, the formidable leader of the Brookside Meadows HOA. She was known for an ironclad devotion to neighborhood aesthetics, patrolling the streets with a clipboard, issuing violation notices if a mailbox needed repainting or a lawn grew an inch too high. Though I'd never met her, her reputation preceded her, whispered among residents. Karen runs the HOA with an iron fist, and she hates anything that doesn't fit her vision of perfection. For the first few weeks, my life in Brookside Meadows was peaceful. Daisy and Scout adjusted to their small barn, I maintained the yard meticulously, and I even nodded hello to neighbors. Nothing seemed amiss. But soon enough, HOA Karen would catch sight of these unusual animals and decide they had no place in her pristine domain, launching a chain of events that would embroil me, an equine therapy center, and ultimately, federal and state laws. Her vendetta would culminate in a humiliating downfall when she realized she'd tried to impound legally protected therapy horses. One early morning, I led Daisy and Scout out of the barn to the backyard so they could graze on the carefully fenced lawn area. Each horse stood about 3 feet tall at the shoulder, truly miniature compared to standard horses, but large enough that passers-by on the sidewalk might notice them peeking over the fence. Daisy, a palomino with a creamy coat and gentle eyes, had a knack for comforting anxious children, while Scout, a dappled gray with a playful streak, excelled at helping kids with autism develop motor skills and confidence. In my old city practice, we'd use these minis in a shared stable an hour away, but now I had them in my own yard for easy, flexible sessions with local clients. My plan was to host a limited number of therapy appointments at my home, only a few families a week in the afternoons. Each session typically lasted an hour, focusing on equine-assisted activities like grooming, leading, or simply bonding with the horses in a structured therapeutic environment. I felt it would be less disruptive than a full-scale stable, given these horses were small and quiet, rarely neighing loudly. They weren't typical livestock, but recognized therapy animals under specific guidelines. However, from the moment I guided them outside that morning, I noticed a figure lingering across the street. A tall, thin woman with neatly styled hair and pressed capri pants seemed to be assessing me from behind sunglasses. She eventually left. I had no clue at the time, but that was Karen Lancaster, her first glimpse of the illegal farm animals that would spark her anger. I simply continued brushing Daisy's mane, unaware that a storm of HOA drama was brewing. That afternoon, I found a typed note on my door. Notice: potential violation. Resident: my name, address, Hawthorne Lane. It has come to our attention that livestock may be present on your property, potentially violating the Brookside Meadows Covenants, Section 8.3. Please cease and desist until the HOA can determine compliance. Karen Lancaster, HOA President. My stomach twisted. I knew the rules allowed for therapy animals if properly documented. So I wrote a polite email to Karen, attaching a copy of my equine therapy license and official letters from the Sunrise Equine Therapy Center, verifying Daisy and Scout were recognized therapy animals. I explained they were miniature horses, medically cleared for therapy usage, and no standard farm operation was happening. I asked for a meeting to clarify any concerns. I believed a calm conversation would settle matters. Karen's reply was curt. Subject: Livestock Notice. Ms., my last name. The HOA maintains strict guidelines prohibiting farm or livestock animals unless explicitly exempted in writing by the board. Your claim of therapy animals must be reviewed. We do not recognize them as service dogs or typical companion animals. Please refrain from keeping them visible to neighbors. Regards, Karen Lancaster, President. My frustration rose. We do not recognize them as service dogs was an odd statement. Federal guidelines often recognize miniature horses as service or therapy animals in certain contexts. But apparently Karen had made up her mind. I wrote back politely, referencing relevant laws about miniature horses used in therapy or service roles, but she did not respond further. Instead, she escalated. I had no clue how far she'd go to rid the neighborhood of my beloved Daisy and Scout. I decided to attend the next monthly HOA board meeting, hoping to present my official documents, including a letter from Sunrise Equine Therapy Center describing how Daisy and Scout had been certified for emotional support sessions. Maybe if the board saw the evidence, they'd override Karen's hostility. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building near the subdivision entrance. About 20 residents showed up to watch the proceedings, though most agenda items were typical: landscaping budgets, mailbox repairs, updates on the pool hours. Karen sat at the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other members: Ms. Reyes, Mr. Green, Ms. Delgado, and Mr. Turner. She wore a pastel blazer, hair coiffed, lips pressed in a thin line. When it came time for resident concerns, I raised my hand and introduced myself, politely summarizing the therapy animals situation. I showed them a folder with my state license as a mental health counselor specialized in equine-assisted therapy, documentation from Sunrise Equine Therapy Center verifying Daisy and Scout's official standing as recognized therapy minis, a copy of city codes and references to the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, guidelines about miniature horses for certain service or therapy roles. Karen barely glanced at the documents. She launched into a speech about Brookside Meadows is a high-standard community that doesn't allow farm animals. We must preserve aesthetics and property values. She insisted therapy or not, horses equaled livestock. Residents shouldn't have to see or smell livestock, she declared. I calmly countered that miniature horses often qualify similarly to service dogs, especially in therapy contexts, that they were small, well cared for, not typical barnyard animals. Ms. Reyes asked if the horses made noise or smelled. I explained they produced minimal odor if cleaned daily and were quieter than most dogs. I only had 2 minis, not a herd. They were contained behind a privacy fence, so neighbors wouldn't see them much. Mr. Green seemed sympathetic, remarking that if they were legitimate therapy animals, maybe we could accommodate them. A mess. Delgado asked about insurance liability if visitors came for therapy sessions. I assured them we had coverage from the Equine Therapy Center for all sessions, plus personal liability coverage on my homeowner's policy. But Karen wouldn't budge, citing overwhelming resident disapproval. She claimed people had complained about unsightly animals. She offered no proof, just vague references. After a tense discussion, the board decided to table the issue until next month to research the rules. Karen promised to investigate the matter thoroughly. Meanwhile, she advised me to remove the horses from the premises until an official decision. I refused politely, stating the law allowed me to keep my licensed therapy animals. The meeting ended in stalemate, with Karen's stern glare telegraphing her next move would be more aggressive. I left uneasy but resolved to stand by Daisy and Scout's right to remain. Over the next week, Karen stepped up her campaign. I found multiple violation notices slipped under my door or taped to my mailbox, each citing prohibited livestock or failure to remove animals as requested. She threatened daily fines of $50 if I didn't comply. I emailed back citing the documents, but she ignored my messages. A few neighbors quietly warned me that Karen sometimes used intimidation tactics. She'll keep piling up violation fees, potentially file a lien on your home if you refuse to pay. The notion alarmed me. Meanwhile, I tried to keep Daisy and Scout's presence discreet. They spent most time in the enclosed barn, only outside for short grazing periods. I had to continue therapy sessions, though, as one local child with anxiety, Kayla, visited twice weekly. Kayla's mother parked discreetly near my driveway so Kayla could gently groom Scout, practicing calm breathing. The sessions were transformative for Kayla. Yet each time, I worried Karen might pounce, complaining about unapproved visitors. Sure enough, one day, I saw Karen snapping photos from across the street as Kayla walked Scout in a circle. I confronted Karen politely, saying, "This is a private therapy session. Please respect confidentiality." She glared, stating, "You're violating HOA rules." "I'm gathering evidence to present to the board. These are not legitimate service animals." She marched off. Kayla's mother was shocked by the hostility. "She's upset about a child's therapy? That's heartless," she whispered, hugging her daughter. The next day, a letter arrived from the HOA's attorney, referencing continued noncompliance with bylaws banning livestock. They threatened legal action. I forwarded everything to Sunrise Equine Therapy Center's legal advisor, who assured me we had a strong case. If push comes to shove, we can show how miniature horses used for therapy fall under certain ADA-like protections, they said. And state law might support them as well. We can't let them bully you. Still, the stress mounted. Each morning, I checked if Daisy and Scout were safe, fearing Karen might attempt something extreme. My instincts proved right. I hadn't guessed she'd escalate to calling in animal control to forcibly impound them, a shocking move that would spark a full-blown crisis in Brookside Meadows. One Tuesday afternoon, as I returned from errands, I spotted a county animal control truck parked near my house. Anxiety flared. I rushed over, finding two uniformed officers speaking with Karen on my front lawn. My heart pounded. Through my fence slats, I saw Daisy and Scout anxiously pacing, clearly disturbed by strangers. Karen gestured animatedly at the officers, pointing to the yard. "Yes, they're large farm animals. We want them removed. The HOA doesn't allow livestock." She refused to comply. I jumped out of my car, hurrying over. "Excuse me, what's going on?" One officer turned. "Ma'am, are these your horses?" We received a complaint of illegal livestock being kept in a residential zone. I produced my therapy center letters, explaining they were licensed therapy animals, not typical livestock. The officer shrugged sympathetically. "We only respond to calls about farm animals in prohibited areas. If it's truly a therapy arrangement recognized by law, we need documentation." But Ms. Lancaster claims otherwise. Karen interjected, "She's shown no real proof. Our bylaws ban farm animals. I demand you remove them to the county shelter until she's in compliance." I argued, referencing the city code allowing certain therapy minis, but the officer said, "That might be overshadowed by HOA covenants. Let's check if you have official service or therapy status." We see folks claim that, but the animals turn out untrained. We must act per the complaint. I tried calling Sunrise Equine Therapy Center's legal rep, but she was unavailable. The second officer frowned, saying, "We can temporarily impound them if there's confusion about legality." Once you prove they're legitimate therapy animals, you'll be able to retrieve them. That's standard protocol. My stomach clenched. Karen smirked. She had orchestrated this, hoping I couldn't produce immediate ironclad proof to the officer's satisfaction. The official letters I had might not suffice if the county procedure required more. The officers gave me a few minutes to gather my documents. Meanwhile, Karen insisted they proceed. Look, they're not recognized as dogs or typical service animals. She's stalling. Despite my frantic pleas, the officers explained they had to follow their standard approach. They led Daisy and Scout, shaking, confused, into a waiting livestock trailer. I felt tears sting my eyes. Daisy pressed her muzzle against my hand in fear. My heart broke. Karen watched with a self-satisfied expression, telling the officers, "Thank you for keeping our community free of unlawful livestock." Moments later, the trailer pulled away with my beloved horses. I was left reeling on the curb, phone in hand, trying to contact anyone who could intervene. This was beyond a typical HOA tiff. Karen had forcibly removed my therapy animals. The next steps would revolve around proving their status swiftly to free them from impound. But the emotional damage was done. I resolved that Karen would not get away with this cruelty. The Equine Therapy Center, and likely the law, would have something to say about it. In the aftermath, I felt a swirl of rage and despair. Daisy and Scout sat in a county holding facility for livestock at risk of prolonged separation from me. That alone could set back their therapy training or cause them stress. Meanwhile, Kayla's mother called me in tears, worried about how losing Scout sessions might affect her daughter's progress. Another client, an adult with PTSD, emailed anxiously, asking if we could still do sessions. My entire practice was disrupted by Karen's power trip. I rallied the Equine Therapy Center's legal team. They were appalled by the impound. They gathered official licensing documents proving the horses had state recognition as therapy animals. The center's director, Dr. Winston, wrote a scathing letter to the county, explaining that miniature therapy horses are legal under the ADA in certain circumstances and recognized by state regulations for emotional support in mental health contexts. The county's standard livestock classification might not apply. Dr. Winston demanded immediate release of Daisy and Scout. At the same time, neighbors who'd heard about the fiasco expressed shock. Some posted on the community's social media group, "HOA president confiscates therapy horses. This is outrageous." People who'd once tolerated Karen's strictness realized she'd crossed a moral line. Even those who disliked having horses next door sympathized with the cruelty of forcibly impounding therapy animals. The tide began turning against Karen in a big way. Desperate to get Daisy and Scout back quickly, I visited the county animal shelter to present my documentation. The staff said they had to confirm with their supervisor or possibly wait for a judge's ruling if the HOA contested. I was told about daily impound fees, $40 per day per horse. Furious, I realized Karen's complaint might cost me hundreds if this dragged on. But Dr. Winston assured me they'd help cover costs or recoup them once we proved the impound was wrongful. Meanwhile, Ms. Reyes from the HOA board quietly told me that Karen had not consulted the board on calling animal control. She acted alone. Ms. Reyes said several members were furious, seeing it as an abuse of authority. Ms. Reyes recommended I gather all supporting documents for the next board meeting or potential legal hearing, predicting Karen's actions might be overruled swiftly. I prayed the system would move fast. Daisy and Scout didn't deserve jail time in a livestock pen. The next day, Dr. Winston visited the county shelter with me, brandishing an impressive dossier, official state licensing, veterinarian records, photos of Daisy and Scout working with patients, and even references from psychiatrists who recommended equine therapy. The shelter staff recognized the seriousness. Usually, they impounded goats or pigs from city-suburb boundaries after neighbor complaints, rarely dealing with therapy minis. The staff admitted they lacked experience in ADA-like cases. They decided to consult their legal department, meaning more delays. Meanwhile, the clock ticked and daily impound fees mounted. In parallel, Dr. Winston's legal advisor emailed Karen directly, copying the entire HOA board, describing how her complaint was baseless under state and possibly federal guidelines. The letter demanded Karen or the HOA reimburse the impound costs, stating that miniature therapy horses are not typical livestock. Quoting case law, it explained that if used for legitimate mental health therapy, they fall under specific exceptions. The letter concluded with a warning: if Karen persisted, we'd consider filing a civil suit for damages, as the impound harmed my therapy practice and the animal's well-being. Karen responded with a short, dismissive note: the board has not granted an exception for these animals. Our CCRs stand. We see no reason to pay any fees. We consider them farm animals. This stance outraged Dr. Winston, who exclaimed, "She's playing with fire. We have the law on our side." At the same time, Tasha, a staffer at the therapy center, reached out to local media. A small local TV station picked up the story: HOA impounds therapy horses? A suburban power struggle. They interviewed me briefly, capturing my tearful explanation of how Daisy and Scout help children. The story painted Karen's action as cruel and potentially illegal. The broadcast triggered a wave of sympathy among viewers. Some started calling the county shelter, asking them to release the horses. Others left comments online blasting Karen's overreach. The pressure began mounting. Ms. Reyes told me from the inside that Karen was alarmed by the negative PR, but refused to back down. She insisted it was a matter of principle, that the neighborhood didn't need barn animals. Ms. Reyes said the next board meeting was a week away. Maybe we could force a vote to disclaim Karen's unilateral complaint. In the meantime, Dr. Winston and I kept pressing the county shelter to expedite the review. The horse's future, and Karen's ultimate reckoning, hung in the balance. On Thursday afternoon, the County Animal Control's legal counsel finally reviewed our documentation. I received a phone call from an official named Ms. Templeton. She explained the shelter had concluded that my miniature horses, Daisy and Scout, did indeed qualify under state guidelines for therapy animals, not standard livestock. Ms. Templeton apologized for the inconvenience, saying the complaint from the HOA president led them to act, but now they recognized it was an erroneous classification. She told me I could retrieve my horses the next morning. However, the county still expected me to pay the impound fees for the days they'd spent. The total was over $400. Furious, I pointed out we'd done nothing illegal. Ms. Templeton said, "We understand, but typically the complainant doesn't pay impound fees unless there's a legal settlement. That's between you and the HOA or Ms. Lancaster. We have no mechanism to bill her directly." I thanked Ms. Templeton for clarifying, though the notion of shelling out $400 for Karen's false complaint stung. Still, at least I could bring Daisy and Scout home. That was priority number one. I told Dr. Winston the outcome, and she indicated we could recoup the fees from Karen if we threatened legal action. Meanwhile, the local news station prepared a follow-up. County releases impounded therapy horses. Are HOA complaints going too far? Early Friday, I drove to the shelter with a borrowed horse trailer from the therapy center. Daisy and Scout seemed relieved to see me. They pressed their muzzles against my hands, as if to say, "Where were you?" My heart ached. I soothed them, checking for any sign of stress or neglect. They appeared physically fine, just anxious. I paid the hefty impound bill. The clerk apologized again, repeating that the complaint forced our hand. The anger at Karen's arrogance simmered in me. We loaded the horses, heading back to Brookside Meadows. By the time we arrived, word had spread that the county declared them legitimate therapy animals. Several neighbors watched from their porches, clapping softly or waving. One or two approached, offering quiet congratulations. Karen was nowhere in sight, though Ms. Reyes texted me that Karen was fuming behind closed doors. The next HOA board meeting was 3 days away, and Ms. Reyes hinted that Ms. Delgado planned to introduce a motion to censure Karen for abusing her authority. Tension soared. Meanwhile, local media and the public turned heavily against Karen. The stage was set for her comeuppance. The return of Daisy and Scout to my backyard felt like a personal victory. I resumed gentle therapy sessions, albeit we stayed mindful of potential harassment from Karen. But something remarkable happened. Many neighbors who'd been neutral or even wary of horses began approaching me with supportive words. They empathized with how Karen's extreme step upset the entire community. Some recalled she'd meddled in lesser ways, fining people for minor paint mismatches or borderline lawn heights, but impounding therapy horses took her tyranny to another level. A neighbor, Mr. Salazar, visited with his teenage daughter who loved horses. He said, "We're so sorry you had to go through this. Karen doesn't represent all of us. Let me know if you need help building a more private enclosure." Another neighbor dropped off a basket of carrots for Daisy and Scout. They recognized how beneficial these minis were for mental health. My phone buzzed with messages from local families wanting to learn more about therapy sessions. The fiasco ironically boosted awareness of my practice. Karen, on the other hand, faced rising hostility. People condemned her on the neighborhood forum, posting, "Impounding therapy animals was heartless." A small recall petition circulated quietly, though none had the energy to push it forward. Ms. Reyes told me Karen was outraged by the negative press. She apparently insisted the press coverage was biased, refusing to apologize. She also refused to reimburse the $400 impound fee, stating it was your fault for bringing livestock. Ms. Reyes called that unconscionable, but Karen wouldn't budge. Amid this tension, the upcoming HOA board meeting loomed. Ms. Delgado confided that she planned to introduce a formal resolution clarifying that recognized therapy animals were allowed. Mr. Green intended to propose that the HOA cover any impound fees wrongly incurred by a board member's unilateral complaint. If the board passed these motions, Karen's position would be severely undermined. She might face censure or loss of power. The entire neighborhood seemed primed for a showdown. Meanwhile, the local news teased a story about the final verdict in the therapy horse saga, fueling more public attention. When the Monday evening of the HOA board meeting arrived, the clubhouse was packed far beyond usual attendance. Everyone wanted to see how the board would address Karen's unilateral actions. Daisy and Scout's story had become the talk of the neighborhood. The mood felt electric. Karen sat at the center of the board table, stiff-backed, flanked by Ms. Reyes, Mr. Green, Ms. Delgado, and Mr. Turner. She hammered the gavel to start, trying to maintain composure. The audience's eyes fixed on her. After routine business, Ms. Delgado spoke up. "Next item, the issue of the miniature therapy horses belonging to Ms. My name on Hawthorne Lane and the recent impoundment." The room hushed. Ms. Delgado turned to me, inviting me to share an update. I stood, calmly summarizing how the county had deemed Daisy and Scout legitimate therapy animals, not standard livestock. I mentioned the $400 impound fee forced on me by Karen's complaint. Applause and murmurs of sympathy erupted from neighbors. Karen looked visibly annoyed, rapping her pen on the table. Ms. Delgado then read her proposed motion. Officially recognize that therapy or service animals, including miniature horses, are permitted under HOA guidelines, so long as the owner provides valid documentation. Reimburse me for any impound fees resulting from the wrongful complaint. Censure Karen Lancaster for calling animal control without board consensus or verifying documentation. The crowd reacted with approval, many nodding or clapping. Karen tried to retort, claiming, "Our CCRs explicitly ban livestock, and I saw no conclusive proof they were therapy animals at the time." Ms. Delgado pointed out I had emailed official letters to Karen weeks prior. Ms. Reyes confirmed that. Mr. Green said, "Karen, you disregarded the homeowner's provided evidence," then escalated. "This isn't how we do things. We must rectify the harm done." Karen bristled. "I acted to uphold community standards. We can't allow random barn animals. This sets a bad precedent." The audience groaned. Ms. Delgado insisted we were discussing licensed therapy minis, not random farm animals. Mr. Turner, usually quiet, chimed in that Karen's approach cost the homeowner money and traumatized the animals. The crowd cheered him on. Finally, Ms. Delgado called for a board vote on the motion. Ms. Reyes voted yes, Mr. Green voted yes, Ms. Delgado herself voted yes, and Mr. Turner also voted yes. Karen was the lone no. The motion carried 4-1. Applause thundered. People cheered. Ms. Delgado announced that the HOA would reimburse me for the $400 impound fee, plus any related legal costs, and that Karen would face censure for overstepping her authority. She hammered the gavel to finalize the decision. Karen sat there, lips pressed tight, humiliated by the overwhelming rejection of her stance. Neighbors who'd once feared Karen's wrath now saw she was vulnerable, outvoted, and scorned. Cameras from the local news captured the moment, noting the board's condemnation of Karen's actions. I felt relief wash over me. At last, official recognition from the HOA, plus restitution for the wrongful impound. Karen's attempts to destroy Daisy and Scout's place in Brookside Meadows had crumbled. In the aftermath, the board's public censure hammered Karen's reputation. A formal letter sent to all homeowners declared that Karen had acted unilaterally, ignoring the homeowners' provided documentation, resulting in an unjust impound of legitimate therapy animals. The letter apologized for the distress caused, promising the HOA's new policy would respect lawfully recognized therapy or service animals. It concluded by stating Karen's misconduct was on record and that she was prohibited from taking unilateral enforcement actions without board consensus. Though Karen remained on the board, her term not yet expired, her influence evaporated. Board meetings saw her repeatedly outvoted. She tried picking fights on smaller issues, but Ms. Delgado or Ms. Reyes calmly shut her down. Neighbors ostracized her socially. Some who'd once admired her strictness realized it could become cruelty. She retreated from public events, no longer strolling the streets with a clipboard. Her aura of power was gone. Meanwhile, the HOA promptly cut me a check covering the $400 plus a bit extra for legal fees. Ms. Delgado personally delivered it with a kind apology. She expressed relief that Daisy and Scout were safe. The local news covered the resolution, praising how the board corrected Karen's overreach. The therapy center's staff and clients rejoiced at the outcome, grateful the minis could remain. Kayla's mother tearfully thanked me, hugging Scout's muzzle in relief. As word spread beyond Brookside Meadows, the story became an example of HOAs gone too far. The final condemnation of Karen in official minutes read like a cautionary tale. She'd tried to brand therapy minis as illegal livestock, ignoring well-established service animal guidelines, only to be publicly shamed, forced to reimburse fees, and stripped of her power. Her name became synonymous with petty tyranny. She'd face that stigma for the remainder of her time in Brookside Meadows if she chose to stay. With the fiasco resolved, I found a renewed sense of peace in Brookside Meadows. Daisy and Scout settled back into their routine, quiet morning grazing, gentle sessions with clients, occasional short walks along the private walkway in the backyard. Freed from fear of impound or fines, I expanded my therapy offerings a bit, seeing a handful more local children and adults who struggled with emotional or developmental issues. The small barn in my yard became a place of healing rather than controversy. Neighbors who'd once kept their distance were now more open. Some even asked if they could let their children meet Daisy or Scout. I obliged, setting up carefully supervised introductions that occasionally blossomed into mini therapy sessions. Kayla's mother spread the word about how the horses helped her daughter's anxiety. Soon, families from within Brookside Meadows formed a supportive network around the idea of equine-assisted therapy, forging a stronger community bond. The board, under Ms. Delgado's leadership, updated the CCRs to explicitly state, therapy or service animals, including recognized miniature horses, are exempt from livestock prohibitions when properly documented and contained. This prevented future Karens from misusing the rules. Ms. Reyes told me they'd learned a lesson about balancing aesthetic concerns with empathy for mental health needs. The new policy garnered praise from outside mental health advocates, who cited Brookside Meadows as an example of an HOA evolving for inclusivity. Karen rarely appeared at public gatherings. Some said she might sell her home once her term ended. Whether she stayed or not, her reign as the dreaded HOA Karen had ended in disgrace. Meanwhile, the story of the impounded therapy horses freed by HOA reversal lingered in local lore, retold by neighbors with exasperation or awe. For me, the silver lining was how it showcased the power of laws, compassionate communities, and activism in defending legitimate therapy animals. Daisy and Scout continued brightening the lives of those who needed them most, a testament that no matter how controlling an HOA leader might be, compassion and lawful rights can triumph. Several months later, a surprising visitor rang my doorbell. Lisa, a woman in her 20s who had previously participated in therapy sessions with Daisy back at Sunrise Equine Therapy Center. She'd been traveling for work but heard about the controversy through social media. Moved by my perseverance, she dropped by to express gratitude. Years ago, Daisy helped me overcome severe anxiety. I can't imagine how horrifying it must have been to see her impounded, Lisa said, tears in her eyes. We walked to the backyard, where Lisa reunited with Daisy, gently stroking the mare's mane. Daisy recognized her, pressing her muzzle into Lisa's shoulder. The moment underscored how these animals were no mere livestock. They forged deep emotional bonds, providing unique healing. Lisa told me, "The fact you fought an entire HOA for them is amazing. People need to realize these horses can save lives in a mental health sense." She asked about Karen's fate. I explained the censure, the humiliating fiasco. Lisa shook her head. Some folks can't see beyond rules or appearances, missing the big picture of what therapy animals do. Indeed, that was the crux. Karen fixated on aesthetics, ignoring the life-changing potential of equine therapy. She'd paid a steep price for her short-sightedness. Lisa's visit ended with a heartfelt photo of her hugging Daisy, which she posted online with a caption praising the brave mini horse who overcame HOA injustice. It went modestly viral among animal therapy circles, furthering the positive narrative around Daisy and Scout. At that point, the entire fiasco had ended months earlier, but the aftershocks of goodwill continued. Karen, ironically, had catapulted these minis into minor local fame. As the next HOA election approached, rumors suggested Karen might try to run again or sabotage from behind the scenes. But the negativity around her impound fiasco left her with minimal support. Ms. Delgado, Ms. Reyes, and Mr. Grant formed a reform slate, promising more open-minded leadership. On Election Day, they won in a landslide, while Karen garnered only a handful of votes. She quietly stepped down from the board, no fanfare, overshadowed by the memory of her greatest failure, trying to drive out legitimate therapy animals. To add a final note of poetic justice, the HOA records indicated that the impound reimbursement check for $400 and an additional payment for my legal fees came from the HOA's enforcement budget, which ironically Karen had once boasted of controlling. The board decided that the person who triggered the complaint should be financially responsible. Under pressure, Karen ended up paying half from her own pocket as part of a settlement Ms. Delgado arranged to avoid further lawsuits. Ms. Reyes told me privately she was furious, but we had the votes to force it. It's only fair. In essence, Karen was punished by losing her position, her reputation, and having to cover the fees caused by her wrongful complaint. The final blow was the humiliation of being known throughout Brookside Meadows as the woman who tried to impound therapy horses, only to be slapped down by the board's ruling and official state law. With Karen gone from power, Brookside Meadows enjoyed a calmer, more compassionate ambience. The new board's approach was less militant about petty infractions, focusing instead on genuine neighborly concerns. Daisy and Scout continued their quiet life in my backyard, offering comfort and healing to clients. Kayla advanced leaps and bounds in her anxiety management. Another child with autism made remarkable progress in social interaction after weekly sessions with Scout. Word traveled, leading to a gentle trickle of new clients seeking equine therapy. The local media did a follow-up piece, showing how the mini horses thrived despite the earlier drama, praising the new board for its open-mindedness. Occasionally, I glimpsed Karen's figure from afar, still living in the neighborhood, but keeping a low profile. She avoided events, never acknowledging me if we crossed paths. Some neighbors believed she might eventually move away to avoid the stigma. Meanwhile, Ms. Delgado led the board in a small ceremony, awarding me a Community Enhancement Acknowledgement for providing unique mental health services that benefited local families. Even city council members chimed in, calling it an innovative example of therapy integration in a suburban environment. At last, the dust settled. Daisy and Scout enjoyed a stable life, free from the threat of impound, recognized officially as therapy animals under both local and state guidelines. The fiasco with HOA Karen served as a lesson that compassion and lawful rights can triumph over a petty authoritarian approach. The entire fiasco ended in a manner befitting poetic justice. Karen left publicly shamed, out of power, and forced to pay for the damages she caused. The neighborhood found a sense of renewal, embracing these beloved therapy minis who quietly enriched lives, one gentle hoofbeat at a time. Months melted into a serene routine. Each dawn, I let Daisy and Scout out to graze in the yard, the sunrise casting their small silhouettes on the neatly trimmed grass. Some early risers passing by would wave or blow kisses to the horses, no longer seeing them as intrusive or unsightly. Families scheduling therapy appointments came discreetly, guided by my new fence gate sign reading, "Equine therapy in session. Please respect quiet." One crisp morning, Ms. Reyes dropped by. She explained how the board had updated the bylaws to clearly exempt recognized service or therapy animals of any species recognized under state/federal guidelines from the livestock ban. "It's official. No more confusion," she said, smiling. She gave me a copy of the revised CCRs. Flicking through it, I spotted the new language referencing miniature horses for therapy. My heart lifted, feeling vindicated. Daisy and Scout's place here was firmly enshrined. As Ms. Reyes left, I reflected on the entire saga. Karen's petty vendetta, her brazen call to animal control, and the heart-wrenching impound. The wave of community outrage, the behind-the-scenes legal scramble, culminating in the board's censure and the rightful punishment, Karen paying the impound fees and losing her presidency. The fiasco had tested me, but in the end, the community discovered empathy overshadowed aesthetics. Brookside Meadows recognized the immeasurable value of a gentle muzzle and the calm presence of a miniature horse, healing hearts in ways no ordinary pet or therapy device could. And so, the story ended with Karen stripped of power, socially isolated, and forced to cover the very fees she'd instigated by lodging a false complaint. Meanwhile, Daisy and Scout remained, living embodiments of how compassion and law can overrule even the most dictatorial HOA president. The final conclusion was as simple as it was satisfying. In a quiet suburban yard, 2 miniature therapy horses grazed contentedly under the sun, unbothered by the pettiness of one woman's quest for control, and the neighborhood was richer for it.